Hello, everyone, and Happy New Year. Welcome to a special GZERO Media live stream. I'm Meredith Sumpter, the CEO of the Council for Inclusive Capitalism, and today we're talking about the greatest geopolitical threats of 2021 as identified by Eurasia Group in its annual Top Risks report. From the ongoing COVID pandemic to China's place in the world order and a new US president just days away from his inauguration. We've got a lot of ground to cover in the next 30 minutes. I'm joined today by Ian Bremmer, the president and founder of Eurasia Group and GZERO Media. Hello, Ian.
Hey, good to be with everybody.
As well as Eurasia Group's chairman, Cliff Kupchan. Welcome, Cliff.
Hi, thank you.
Ian, let's start with you. So some members of our audience may be unfamiliar with the annual Top Risks report. So before we dive in, can you briefly share what it is and why you, Cliff, and Eurasia Group analysts write it every year?
Sure. We try to look at where the world is heading in the coming 12 months. It helps us get our heads in order, as we come back from vacation this year, such as it is. And it is pretty systematic. I mean, we've got almost 200 people in the firm around the world. They all come together as one big dysfunctional family, and they spar over it for weeks, even months before the year hits. We look, in terms of the ordering, we look at both the impact of the risk, assuming it occurs, the likelihood, and the imminence. We put all three of them together, and that gives you your rank order. And then we keep the top risks on our homepage all year long. At the end of the year, we go back and we see how we did. It's very important, we think, to keep ourselves honest about, when people know that you're actually going to be judged on the basis of whether this stuff actually goes forward, you do a better job in terms of what you're putting out there. And again, it just feels like good exercise analytically for being sharp analysts around the world.
And from what I recall, having worked on many of these reports, Eurasia Group has a decent track record of being able to forecast where the world is going and the greatest threats that we're facing.
It hasn't sucked. It's true.
Cliff, so Top Risks is a list of 10 threats, but obviously there's a lot of interconnections. For example, the pandemic touches nearly every aspect of politics and global economics. So can you share with us, as you and the team were putting this year's report together, what were some of the key overarching themes that emerged?
Well, sure, and thanks, Meredith. I'd list three themes, I think. The first would be the lasting scar tissue. Long COVID is the risk. The lasting scar tissue of the pandemic, which creates haves and have-nots, haves and have-nots within countries and between countries. And that sort of dynamic infuses, I would say, Latin America, Middle East, Turkey, Europe. It infuses a lot of our risks. The second overarching theme would be increasing geopolitical recession, increasing G0, a U.S. that's really just too divided to govern itself or the international system. And that's really the context, the backdrop for what we're writing about this year. Third, U.S.-China. It's something that is the leading contest in the international system right now. And again, infuses, is a risk in and of itself and infuses lots of other risks. So those are the three big themes, I think, we find throughout the report.
Yeah, and listening to you talk, Cliff, I want to turn back to you as well, because, the world of geopolitical risk pre-2020, pre-pandemic was a certain way, and you had made calls about where the world was going. But how did the experience of this global pandemic over the course of the last year, how is it changing the nature of political risk or geopolitical risk?
Well, you can talk about a GZERO world. You can talk about an absence of global leadership. You can talk about more divides, both globally and inside your country. And yet, absent a crisis, it doesn't feel urgent. It's like we've been talking about climate change for decades, but aside from the people that are actually experiencing the floods and the droughts and the displacements, it hasn't felt urgent. So people haven't dealt with it. The GZERO is now starting to feel urgent. The risks are accelerating, and that's been made very clear. I mean, start at home in the United States with the illegitimacy in perception of so many American political institutions. I mean, when I started Eurasia Group, many people around the world did see the United States not just as the most powerful country, but also as a country that was a leader in governance, that had some of the strongest political institutions, the most stable, the most open. No one would say that anymore. And it's been clarified by the coronavirus, the degree to which, facing the worst crisis of our lifetimes, that the United States has failed to be effective, not only in international response, but in domestic response right here. The families of 350,000 Americans know that very, very clearly. The same thing can be said about the US-China relationship. We know it's been getting more tense, but it got a lot worse and a lot faster because of coronavirus. Because, I mean, not only were we not coming together to respond to that crisis, but we were blaming each other. I mean, the Americans going after China for lying about where the virus came from for the first 4 weeks, while hundreds of thousands of Chinese from Wuhan were traveling all over the world, including to the United States, and intensifying, sharpening disputes over things like vaccines, over the World Health Organization, the U.S. leaving the World Health Organization in the middle of a pandemic. I mean, Meredith, that's an obscenity. And yet it kind of is a geopolitically obvious point in a GZERO world when you're stressing these institutions that a lot of Americans increasingly don't believe in.
Well, right. And as we have that next administration take the helm, it's more than an uphill battle to be able to reclaim some mantle of global leadership at a time when, as you're saying, the pandemic has really sown doubts about who should be leading the global order, how capable that power would be in leading the global order. But look, we're going to be taking a deep dive into a few of these risks. But first, we want to involve members of our audience in the discussion. So if you're watching on GZERO Media's website, you can submit questions for Ian and Cliff via our chat function and also participate in a live poll. So all you need to do is to sign into the chat window using Vimeo, Facebook, or as a guest. And then you can cast your vote to the following question. So here's a poll question. In 2021, which of the following will pose the greatest geopolitical risk? Is it A, political polarization in the United States, B, the economic fallout of the pandemic, or C, US-China tensions? So cast your vote and we will reveal the answer later in the show and see how close you are to Ian and Cliff's predictions. All right, so as our audience members are voting, I want to touch on a few of the risks this year that are really perplexing global leaders. So these are the risks that involve many nations and that have no easy solutions. And so what I'd like to do is to start with top risk number 4, US-China tensions broaden. Cliff, there's a whole lot we could say about the US-China relationship. And I would say that, some are even predicting that with the Biden administration, we should be seeing something of a detente in the relationship. Briefly share with us the nature of this risk and what our audience should expect in the coming year.
The risk is US-China tension broadens. And the main point is you may well get a little bit of a detente impetus, but it'll be overwhelmed and overcome by really 3 new sources of tension. The first flows from or is Biden's attempt to multilateralize U.S. policy towards China, to enlist our key allies, Japan, India, the EU, in pressuring China, encouraging China to change some of its most objectionable policies. That could lead to trade disruptions between China and those countries. And it could lead to a bidding war, really a fascinating one, but a pretty potentially damaging one between the U.S. and China to win the allegiance, the hearts and minds of other countries. And they could start getting pretty upset with each other. And it's not necessarily a good dynamic. Secondly, vaccine diplomacy. Using vaccines to encourage, to sort of foster soft power, increase soft power. The Chinese are very well positioned to do this because they have done so well at eradicating the vaccine within their own borders or containing it. And Biden, meanwhile, will be focused on the U.S. recovery. If the China does really well, there's going to be a lot of hostility in this country towards the Chinese for sort of outperforming. And then there's a competition on green technology. China's in the lead: batteries, solar, wind, nuclear. The Biden administration will attempt to reshore, attempt to name and shame China for coal, building coal fire-driven coal abroad. That could lead to China, will lead to China having its, wings clipped in that area. They're not going to like that. So these new tensions will add to old tensions: South China Sea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and keep the wood very dry at U.S.-China.
Well, on that, and I want to go to you to get your thoughts on this as well. When reading through this risk on the report, I was really struck by, let's say, China actually having the upper hand in that vaccine diplomacy and using that to even strengthen its position along what Eurasia Group called the global South. So this would be Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America, sources of new growth, not only for China, but for the global economy, as well as even with the Biden administration, we may not be seeing the end of government intervention in industrial policy with the competition over green technology. Ian?
Yeah, I mean, the vaccine issue, 2021 is going to be all about vaccines. And if Biden is unable to succeed on vaccine rollout in his first 100 days, you can kiss his agenda for the administration goodbye, right? I mean, given the level of the crisis. But to be clear, the Chinese economy is the one major economy that rebounded in 2020. And they did that through incredible draconian quarantine and contact tracing and surveillance. Now, what that means is that they don't have very many cases at all. There's no big second wave in China. So yes, they have to use their vaccines for their own people, but they can export at the same time. And that does give them an advantage over this year. It's not 5-10 years, right? Because soon, within 2 or 3 years, everyone is going to have enough vaccines and there'll be production ramped up. But as we're ramping up, the Chinese have an advantage. And let's also keep in mind that the vaccines they are producing, which aren't as effective as the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines that the Americans will be getting, they also don't require the cold chain infrastructure. And that means that they're much more usable for those low and medium income countries around the world that don't have that infrastructure. So when I saw the president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, come out just a week ago and say, well, if the United States doesn't provide 20 million vaccines to the Philippines this year, they're going to kick American troops out of the Philippines. I mean, look, his bark is worse than his bite, but who's happy about that? The Chinese are happy about that. You're going to see Belt and Road plus vaccines, and it's going to lead to political influence over these countries that is greater than what the Chinese had before. Most importantly, in Southeast Asia, China's own backyard, where their economies are already dominant. And the American military footprint is important, but increasingly the balance is tipping towards Beijing.
Ian, let's stick with you. We've heard experts say that the pandemic was the greatest crisis of this year, but that climate is the greatest crisis of this decade and maybe even beyond. And there's some parallels here with Top Risk 4 as we're Eurasia Group is predicting that there's going to be increased competition between the U.S. and China on green technology. Share with us the thinking behind risk number 3, net zero meets GZERO.
The biggest opportunity that comes out of the coronavirus crisis is the fact that governments around the world are leaning much more heavily into sustainability. And this is most obvious in the United States, because if it wasn't for the pandemic, Biden loses. And that means 4 more years of almost climate denialism, but certainly support for coal and fossil fuels more broadly, where Biden's biggest shift, including not just from Trump, but from Biden-Obama 4 years ago, is on climate. It is on trying to really create a climate agenda, both in the United States through executive orders and globally. The Europeans have very much tilted more heavily into climate because of coronavirus. The massive relief and redistribution spearheaded by Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron is oriented towards a green agenda, both at home in terms of spending and stimulus, but also in terms of those that want to trade and have access to the largest common market in the world. And that has led others like Boris Johnson in the UK, like Prime Minister Suga in Japan, like even Xi Jinping in China to take this up. So that's all positive. I mean, it's not positive for fossil fuels players. It's not positive for, let's say, the Gulfies, for Russia, but it's positive for the world. It's positive for species. But this, right. When the Americans start taking climate seriously, whenever we take anything seriously as the most powerful country in the world, we expect that it's going to be our way, that we're going to be the dominant players, just as we have been the dominant player in fossil fuels. And that means that we're going to want to have the operating systems for wind, solar, smart grids, electric vehicles, and the supply chain for those things. Well, you know what? The Chinese have been investing a hell of a lot of money for a decade plus now in exactly those technologies. The Chinese don't see climate as save the whales. They see climate as how does Beijing dominate the post-carbon energy environment. And so I actually think even though it's going to be better for the planet that we're moving towards sustainability, it will also sharpen and intensify U.S.-Chinese competition as we start focusing on these industries.
So, and Cliff, with that risk of that net zero meets GZERO, you have this increased industrial competition and the green technology space that is U.S. and China. So, is that going to keep us from meeting the targets that many of these country governments and companies and industries are currently making?
I think a lot of the targets are reachable in theory, hortatory, probably more some good dose of that. I don't think that the progress will be made. I don't think, in my mind, that's the core of the risk. Isn't to say the progress won't be made. It's to say a lot of other things are going to happen that you may not know about. Increased costs for companies on regulation, other increased costs, the competition, the lack of coordination. I think what Ian was getting to, this isn't climate nirvana, which I think some, even close to common wisdom, is assuming it's going to be. It's going to be a lot messier and a lot more GZERO-y.
So companies trying to navigate this space, there's going to be a whole lot of politics, regulation, and perhaps disruption of the kind of adoption of technologies that would expedite progress towards meeting those targets.
I mean, let's all remember here that we could well have climate financial disclosures upon us very soon. It's a huge new regulation, huge new source of embarrassment, huge new cost, huge new concern that even hedge funds are going to have to worry about. I mean, this is, there's a lot of good stuff going on. And I think people are a lot more aware about that than the dark side of the moon here. And there are both sides of the moon.
Ian, do you fundamentally see the incoming U.S. administration as one that will allow companies to find ways to adopt technologies in the green energy space and green tech space that are not its own? And we've said in the last U.S.-China risk that we should expect an uptick in industrial competition in the green tech space. But knowing U.S. companies as we do, they're going to try to find some way to opportunity. But will they be successful in being able to work with Chinese partners?
And the answer is somewhat. We are not in a Cold War with the Chinese. And I don't think we're close to one. And a big part of the reason for that is not only that there are very strong entrenched interests in the United States and China for a level of interdependence between the two countries' economies, but also that there's enormous misalignment in the United States between what the government would have American companies do for national security and what those companies want to do for their shareholders. And so when you think about a company like Apple, they're not interested in becoming the next Lockheed in the United States. They're interested in selling smart devices to any consumer around the world that can buy them. And if that means they're producing in China, that's perfectly fine as long as they have access to that market. Now, so in other words, we talk about a G0 world. It's not a G2. There's a T2. There are two countries in the world that are technology superpowers, the United States and China. But why isn't that a G2? It's not a G2 because even though the Chinese companies are very aligned with the Chinese government, and when they're not, like with Alibaba, Jack Ma hasn't been seen for a couple months right now. That's not good for Jack Ma, right? But in the United States, those tech companies in libertarian, free-spirited Silicon Valley and other places, they are not lining up with the Pentagon. They're not lining up with the United States national security interests. And so you can't describe this as a cutthroat fight between the Americans and Chinese. It's much more complicated than that. And that means that in many areas, as you said, Meredith, American companies will work very hard to find ways to circumvent the American national security interest. And since we know that the private sector in the US frequently is able to spend money to capture the regulatory process for their own interests, and sometimes that's at the expense of the average American worker, for example, but that can also be at the expense of national security. I mean, the whole idea is that in the United States, the private sector captures the state, where in China, the state captures the private sector. And those are two different challenges for what one had hoped would be the world coming together and having the government as a fair, independent arbiter, trying to upstand regulations that are in the best interests of the entire citizenry.
Yeah, but I think these risk number 4, U.S.-China tensions broaden, and risk number 3, net zero meets G0, is just a really potent mix of the two, which I think both of you have wonderfully laid out for our audience members. And as you point out, the competition is going to be in the space of technology, but also in the standards that are set. With the T2 playing looking to play a dominant role there. Well, listen, let's move on to risk number 2, Cliff, from vaccine distribution to economic recovery. COVID will have a long tail well into 2021 and likely beyond. Break down for us the highlights of risk number 2, long COVID.
Just in brief, it's a pretty complex risk, so I'll try to skin it down here. The main point is that the scar tissue means that we're not heading towards anything new very quickly or anything normal maybe ever by our definition of normal. We will have the K curve, which within every country will cause different socioeconomic groups to recover at different rates. We will have differences between countries as well as within countries, between countries, driven by different access to vaccines, different success in rollouts. And Eurasia Group did a very intensive study. Arguing the U.S. rollout is going to be a lot more complicated than people thought. And so far, I think we've been so right. Unfortunately, the payoff, what's going to happen here is more instability from unhappy populations, more anti-incumbent anger, whether the incumbents are good or bad, because people aren't going to be very happy, and a debt crunch in that lenders are going to be more leery of giving out money as countries accumulate more debt. The numbers just don't work for them. The South Africa, Brazil, Turkey are going to be the real canaries in the coal mine, because they're going to be the biggest countries that are dependent on external financing if lenders start to get queasy, and some smaller countries are going to need to restructure their debt this year. So those are the long tentacles of COVID, the scar tissue, that are going to pervade the international system and really pervade other risks that we wrote about this year.
And what I thought was so thoughtful about this particular risk, Ian, was Eurasia Group noting that it's not just a K-shaped recovery within countries that we're bearing witness to, including here in the United States, but you have a risk of that K-shaped recovery between countries in the international system, especially as those emerging markets, their underlying vulnerabilities being exposed by this long COVID tail.
Yeah, I mean, the vaccines also play out there. I mean, we're going to have those vaccines in the United States in short order, really cutting down mortality. And just in the next few weeks, once we get 10% of the American population vaccinated, your death rate is going to go down to 1/10 of what it has been. Thank God, because those are the people that are most vulnerable. It is going to take a lot longer. It's another 6 months, another 12 months minimum before you get those levels in most of the world's emerging markets. And many of those countries have suffered very, very desperately economically from coronavirus, health-wise from coronavirus. So you've got that problem. And then you also have the reality that in the United States, Europe, Japan, you can spend on stimulus if you can get the government to support it. You can extend credit. In the emerging markets, that's much more of a squeeze. So the potential for real financial crises in countries that are badly managed and don't have a lot of wealth on the back of coronavirus is very, very heavy. 2020 was almost exclusively coronavirus seen through the healthcare lens, seen through the dangers of this pandemic to human beings' health. 2021, it's going to be almost exclusively seen for most of the year through the economic lens. And that is every bit as dangerous for the average person on this planet as the healthcare piece was.
Yes, no, absolutely. And as you note in the report, it's not just the increase or potential increase for a real financial security risk for many of these countries, but that the long tail of COVID into 2021 and beyond will actually make governing harder within each of these countries as well.
That's right. Absolutely.
Well, listen, we're nearly at the top risk of 2021. But first, let's take a look at how the audience voted on what they see as the greatest geopolitical risk of the coming year. So the results are, the winner is the pandemic fallout at 51%. Next up is polarization and the US at 30%. And in third place is US-China tensions at 18%. Ian, Cliff, what do you think about those results?
The winner. I mean, I have to tell you, it's one of the weirdest things for me is that it's so incredibly dystopian that we kick off the year every year by thinking about all of the things that could potentially go badly. But it is an important exercise. I am obviously not surprised at all after suffering since February, March, psychologically with the trauma of this pandemic, which really takes away free will. I mean, there are plenty of silver linings. There are all sorts of people that are incredibly fortunate that haven't lost loved ones and the rest. But still, everyone's life has been maximally disrupted in ways that were unimaginable back in January last year by this coronavirus. Of course, that's number one for everyone. But looking around the corner, we know those vaccines are coming. When I think about what the top risk is, I'm not quite there.
And with that, Cliff, do us the honor of revealing Eurasia Group's top risk for 2021 and explain why it's the dominant risk over long COVID this year.
Top risk we call 46 asterisk. It's the top risk because it has such a tremendous wallop on U.S. domestic politics and by proxy on the international system because the U.S. is the remaining superpower. I mean, look, in brief, there is going to be no new normal in the U.S. We see that now. We've had a president try to take down the election results in Georgia recently. We've seen the all living former secretaries of state, including Dick Cheney, protest. We've seen most of the Republicans, 12 senators and 140 members of the House try to delay the certification. I mean, it's a mix between a documentary and a horror film. It's ugly. So this really comes from the divisions of the U.S. Trump just being, and the Republicans so strong, 74 million votes coming out of the election. It will make domestic policy. The U.S. is just too divided. Domestic policy, large stimulus, healthcare reform probably won't happen. Depending on what happens in Georgia tomorrow, maybe none of it will happen. Executive orders, it doesn't get the president deserves. Biden will be the third president in succession to govern largely by executive order. These things just aren't democratic. They're partisan decrees. They don't strengthen democratic institutions because they're not democratic. the foreign policy, similarly, with a divided country, are the governments really going to trust this country to govern the international system? How can foreign governments kind of deal with the U.S. when the next government could be an America First government again? So what we really see here is a threshold moment, a threshold when every future president probably won't have the support of half of the population. And that changes the way we have to think about the place the world turns when it gets into trouble. That's why it's the top risk, put bluntly.
So, Cliff, you talk about the threshold moment domestically, but there's also a threshold moment here geopolitically as well. And Ian, notably, this is the second year in a row that U.S. domestic politics earned the top slot on this global risk report. In fact, you write, when the most powerful country is so divided, everybody has a problem. So what does this say about where things stand for the U.S. and its global position in this threshold moment?
Can't lead. The world needs leadership, especially in a major crisis, and the United States is in no position to provide it. Either on global trade, we've had the largest trade deals in history signed in the past weeks, RCEP, as well as a new deal between the Chinese and the Europeans. The Americans are no part of it. Couldn't get a big new trade deal if we wanted to. The United States is going to be leaving Afghanistan. Failed war, longest war of American history. I saw Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, was criticizing Myanmar and Cote d'Ivoire for irregularities in their election. You kidding me? The United States has no ability to tell other countries how they should run their elections. The average American doesn't believe that democracy even works for Americans, never mind telling other countries how it should work. So look, we are still the most powerful country in the world. And frankly, it's not that close. But America's ability to lead, America's desire to lead, when the United States is not only the most powerful country, but is also by far the most economically unequal of all of the world's advanced industrial democracies. The United States is by far the most politically divided of all of the world's advanced industrial democracies. In a time of crisis, when you desperately need the new president to come in and get stuff done, you don't need to understand just how dysfunctional that is. And a final point I would make, just in the last 24 hours, a 1 hour plus taped phone call of President Trump telling the Georgia Secretary of State that he won the election and the Secretary of State has to overturn it, lying about that, and using the pressure of the presidency. 10 secretaries of defense, every one that is still alive, writing an op-ed saying, and Dick Cheney taking the lead on this, who thought he'd be a member of the resistance, saying that Biden won the election and the military can't intervene. None of us have seen anything like this in the United States in our lives. There's a reason this is unprecedented. It is structural, and Trump is making it worse, but so are so many things that have been happening in the United States for decades now, and this is not the time to have this kind of a crisis. Hence, that's risk number one.
The U.S. is the most unequal of all the advanced economies and the most politically divided as well. That certainly gives us the 46 asterisk top risk. Thanks very much, Ian and Cliff. We also invited the audience to submit questions, both live and in advance of this program. So before we go, I'd like to ask a few of those and to get your thoughts on them. The first one comes from Gabrielle Soares, who asks, which are the major risks for Latin America this year?
Cliff, all you.
Sure. The major risk for Latin America is that sort of pre-existing conditions will become worse. That the vaccines are likely to be widely distributed until the end of 2021. And the sort of scar tissue from COVID and popular dissatisfaction will cause more protest, more populism, and poor governance. It works through a transmission belt of the heavy electoral calendar in Latin America, legislative in Mexico and Argentina, in a series of presidential elections, Ecuador, Peru, Chile. The Fernandez will be weakened most likely by legislative elections, will come out of the elections with less oomph to tackle hard problems. AMLO will be strengthened, which is not good for the business climate. And in Ecuador especially, but also in other countries with presidential elections, the chance of populism, the anti-incumbent thing, could well give us a less market constructive and a less constructive governance structure. So that's sort of the big picture macro risks surrounding LATAM. Thank you.
Thanks, Luke. We have another question that has come in from Ezra, who asks, what's up with the U.S. military buildup in the Persian Gulf? Is a strike imminent?
I don't think a strike is imminent. But never say never when it comes to President Trump. The desire to create a level of chaos as he faces the last days of his administration are going up. He clearly wants to send a strong message to Iran. They have announced enrichment at 20% level, which is formally in breach of the Iranian nuclear deal that the Americans, of course, unilaterally withdrew from. We just had the 1-year anniversary of the U.S. assassination of Qasem Soleimani, who was the military leader in Iran. Trump saw that as both a risk, but also a big win for the United States, because the Iranians were not able to respond effectively. And so the U.S. got away with it, as it were. But if you asked us, we put this as a red herring in our list this year, Iran generally. And so, yes, they're moving battle forces around. And definitely the Trump administration wants people asking this question, talking about it. They want the Iranians to be rattled by it. But that's very different from the idea that we're about to see military confrontation. Wagging the dog, of all the things that Trump can do in the couple of weeks before he transfers power unwillingly to President-elect Biden, wagging the dog is one thing I don't expect.
It's a very different world than where we were a year ago from now. Ian Bremmer, Kupchan, thank you both for sharing this report with us and for all the great insight from you and the Eurasia Group team. And thank all of you for watching. You can read the entire report and see the complete list of top risks 2021 at eurasiagroup.net/top risks. I'm Meredith Sumpter. Stay safe and have a wonderful new year.